Hello, everyone. My name is Thom Holmes. I would like to thank AMIS for inviting me to participate in this conference. My topic is the idea of using the radio as a musical instrument. What I mean by the word radio is a radio receiver, the commonly found household device used for listening to broadcasts. Some of these works required AM radio, while others used shortwave and FM receivers. I am going to discuss 5 approaches that I have seen used to create works with radio sounds in the field of electronic music. I am going to discuss each work for a few minutes, share a score if one exists, and play a minute or so of sound from the start of each work. This is who I am. If you know me at all, you may know me as the author of Electronic and Experimental Music, a book I published and still publish with Routledge. And I've also recently published a book about sound art. And I produced a podcast called the Holmes Archive of Electronic Music, which features recordings of vintage electronic music. So if you were to create a piece for radio, how would you imagine that it could be organized? Or what process would you use to create a work of radio sounds as the musical instrument? Let's explore a handful of compelling works that did just that and the different approaches taken by their composers. This diverse set of composers includes, and I will feature them in chronological order, John Cage's radio music from 1956, Dick Raymakers' Ballade Erlkönig from 1967, Karlheinz Stockhausen Hertzvalen from 1968, Michael Snow, 2 radio solos from 1980, and Anne Hamilton, Mantle from 1998. The approaches and practices of each of these composers turns the idea of radio inside out so that it is no longer a mere receiver of information from the outside, but a source of unique musical expression of its own. This is a summary of the approaches used by each of the works that we will discuss. John Cage radio frequencies were selected by chance, and the piece was performed in real time. Dick Raymakers, in which pre-recorded shortwave radio sounds were organized and composed using tape composition. Karlheinz Stockhausen, in which real-time shortwave radio signals served as spontaneous inspiration for an ensemble of musicians being guided in their responses by a score. Michael Snow, in which the incoming signal from one radio set served as the material itself and was improvised by a single musician through tuning of the signal. And Anne Hamilton, for which 13 shortwave radios were all tuned to different frequencies and played at once during an exhibition. The grandfather of experimental works for radio is John Cage. Radio music was composed in 1956 during Cage's first 7 to 8 years of composing using chance operations. This was a technique that effectively removed any personal choices and emotional decisions from a work. When I once spoke with him about whether this could be considered a random process or not, he told me that he didn't really believe there was such a thing as randomness, only a person's idea of randomness. So this process, by removing his personal choice from the composition, was his conception of randomness. In any event, many of his works composed in this way were closely timed as to the duration of individual parts, as well as the overall work. In this case, radio music is intended to be exactly 6 minutes long. The instructions are simple, quote, to be performed as a solo or ensemble for 1 to 8 performers, each at one radio, unquote. The associated score indicated 56 different frequencies between 55 and 156 kilohertz, notated with numbers, not on a conventional musical staff. All of these choices were made by chance operations, so there is literally only an unintended uniformity to the composition. Cage indicated that the work was in 4 sections to be programmed by the player or players with or without intervening silences. The score consisted of instructions for the 4 sections, each being similar to the others. A page of the score is seen here. In this case, no specific timings other than to complete the work in 6 minutes were provided. That symbol of the underscore indicated a silence. One must also realize that the score was made in 1956 and related to frequencies then available only on the AM radio spectrum. Shortwave broadcasts were not considered for this piece, and FM was only a future development. There is no recording, of which I am aware, from 1956 by Cage himself, but we have a lovely version realized in Italy in 1974, played by 3 musicians, Gianni Emilio Simonetti, Juan Hidalgo, and Walter Marchetti. This performance was made at a time when the suggested AM frequencies were still in use, but even though the radio spectrum was beginning to be taken over by the FM bands. But the Italian performers were faithful to Cage in interpreting his score, but they switched out the AM frequencies for shortwave bands after transposing the frequencies from Cage's score to what would be a correspondingly narrow range of shortwave signals. So let's listen to a little bit of this piece.
Sono le 22:30. Premissa per l'Europol akin akin.
Now we turn to a work by Dick Raymakers called Ballade Erlkönig. Whereas Cage relied on chance to account for the sounds that appeared in his piece without interjecting his taste or emotions, Raymakers' piece was carefully curated and edited for maximum emotional impact and intended from the outset to be a fixed, complete work. Raymakers was famous by this time for his electronic music compositions of pop music, created at the Philips Labs in the late 1950s as a kind of demonstration of the capabilities of tape music. By 1966, just before this piece was composed, he founded the Electronic Music Studio at the Royal Conservatory of The Hague, where this was produced. It is not a pop tune, however. but an oral interpretation of a narrative by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Goethe's Ballade Erlkönig was a tale of an underworld king, a sick boy, and his father. In Raymakers' notes, he was somewhat reticent about describing the process of composition of this work, yet there are many notes and drawings and tables related to it. He did say that all of the sounds heard were derived from radio and telephone. He created a visual score that you see here, which indicated certain sounds picked up from the radio, such as a symphony by Charles Ives, as well as radio noise and interference. After recording these sounds from the radio, Raymakers used this plan and timings to carefully organize and assemble the sounds with effects in his tape studio. He was fascinated by the psychological effect of shortwave signals. He described the piece as taking, quote, place in the poor man's realm of formlessness, from where incomprehensible messages couched in tiny signals, noises, rattles, notes, chores, and voices emerge in an unbroken stream, unquote, all of which can be represented without prejudice by the objective medium of shortwave signals that are once connected yet disconnected from the human experience. Let's listen to a little bit of this piece by Dick Raymakers. Now we come to Karlheinz Stockhausen and his work for radio called Hertzvalen. We will hear an excerpt from Hertzvalen, an ensemble piece in which the musicians were asked to react to signals they received on randomly tuned shortwave radios. The ensemble instruments were piano, electronium PI, which is a kind of solo organ device with keys, a large tam-tam with a microphone, a viola with contact microphone, and then 2 filters and 4 faders, plus the shortwave receivers for each of the instrumentalists. As the sound mixer, Stockhausen could also apply audio filters to components of the mix. This piece differs significantly from his other shortwave work, Hymnen, from the year before, which was essentially fully edited on tape and fixed. In Hertzvalen, his ensemble was responding in real time to cues they received from whatever shortwave sounds were in the air. Each player, continued Stockhausen in his composition notes, quote, has, in addition to his instrument, a shortwave receiver with which he receives the musical material to which he reacts. He imitates, he transposes it, modulates it, playing together with the others in reciprocal reactions and intermodulations, unquote. Although Stockhausen often used the term improvised to describe what the ensemble was up to, they were at the same time guided as much by the score as by their own instincts, and the entire output was mixed for effect by Stockhausen. We are looking at one page of the combined score for all players. During performance, each player was asked to quietly locate shortwave signals that corresponded to the degree of change prescribed in the score. Once they found a signal, they were required to avoid passages of unmodulated spoken word or music while searching the airwaves. The score itself does not use musical notation, but instead plus, minus, and equal symbols for creating 128 events based on what the individual musicians were hearing. The plus, minus, and equal symbols referred to the dynamics of the sound that could be played to accompany the shortwave signals, such as louder, softer, more rapid, etc. Let's listen to a little bit of Hertzvalen. So that was the beginning of Hertzvalen. At the start of that clip, all the musicians are basically tuning their radios, looking for signals to respond to. And then you gradually hear the incoming sounds of the piano and the modified sounds of a viola and the tam-tam being scraped, that kind of metallic sound. So next is Michael Snow's work, 2 radio solos released on cassette only. In 1980, Canadian filmmaker, musician, and composer Michael Snow recorded some music he improvised for shortwave radio. Each of the 2 radio solos are lengthy at about 30 minutes each. Basically, he just put a cassette in and let it run until he was done with the tape. The energy of these works is really kinetic and fast-paced, whereas both Cage and Stockhausen carefully scored their instructions for their radio works. Snow chooses to improvise more in the spirit of a jazz player. He has a long standing interest in improvised music and is also a professional jazz pianist himself. In this work, Snow sits at a shortwave set and fine-tunes the frequencies to capture the drifting signals as they are received. You can feel the patience with which he caresses the airwaves, tweaking new sounds from in between other frequencies. One will notice that some of the sound becomes sped up rather than being a post-production artifact. This was apparently due to the battery running low on the tape recorder while making the piece. So, and to quote Snow from his notes, quote, "There was no editing, no post-facto electronic alteration. The sounds were found by paying intense attention to fate, tuning in and out and between stations, changing bands, bass, treble, and volume. The tapes were made at night in a remote North Canadian cabin lit by a kerosene lamp." This piece then, for radio, is more in the spirit of what most of us would think of as improvisation: minimal rules, careful listening, and interaction with the sound. So here is a piece called Short Wavelength from 2 radio solos.
Siguiendo con mis artistas plásticos y de los calendarios diseñados para el año que viene.
Our final example of music for radio is Mantle by the sound artist Ann Hamilton. Hamilton created Mantle as part of a site-specific art exhibit at the Miami Art Museum in 1998. The situation was really interesting, and the radios were just one component. In the 3,500 square foot space, a 48-foot long table covered with flowers was the main attraction. Recorded sound in the form of muffled and mechanical voices emanated from 30 loudspeakers buried in the flowers. High up on the shelf were 13 shortwave radios, all tuned to different frequencies and playing constantly. The sound of the shortwave was loud enough to blend with or mask the sounds coming from the loudspeakers among the flowers, disguising the sound sources to the visitor. Whereas Michael Snow's piece was improvised in a real sense by his manipulation of the radio dial, Hamilton's piece coexisted with the exhibit and played continuously for hours without human intervention, other than to occasionally tune in radio signals. This example represents yet another variation on the theme of the radio as a musical instrument. In this case, the radios play unattended, without any human intervention, and the recording captures the moments that were unique to that day and time. Here's a little bit of Mantle by Ann Hamilton. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. Here's a recap of what we've heard and learned about the radio as a musical instrument. This is a repeat of that earlier slide at the beginning. We listened to 5 distinct examples of approaches for scoring and using the radio as the primary instrument in a musical work. If you would like to hear a complete version of each of these 5 works, in higher fidelity, I would add, you can listen to episode 60 of my podcast, the Holmes Archive of Electronic Music. It was great sharing this talk with you. Thank you very much. And now I think we take questions.